several presidents. The United States, the claim that the only good Indian is a dead Indian is completely opposed to what was experienced in the Spanish Empire. Actually, the entire western United States was once Spanish territory, which Mexico lost after independence. Well, the viceroyalty of New Spain. There's a curious paradox. All indigenous people in that area were later systematically wiped out by the Anglo-Saxon Protestant system. People don't want to talk about this. They always remembered that with the Spaniards, they played cards. With the Spaniards, they felt integrated. The Spaniards let them live. Even those who didn't want to be Catholic, though evangelization was said to be imposed. But people don't understand the magnitude of what Spain did to this day.
Look, that's what makes it interesting. Of course, now we're opening another can of worms, the religious one. People today don't really understand this because we're children of our time and in our time. In Europe, societies are very secularized, which doesn't mean they don't have religion. Let me explain. The main religion in Spain today is nihilism. That is to say, this might be a very personal opinion, but I think you can't live without religion. Not in the sense that you have to choose between Christianity, Islam, or something like that. No, it's that religion is a condition of every society. I mean, it's like, well, just as every society has to have inhabitants, because otherwise it wouldn't be a society. It has to have a series of elements, let's say an anthropological vision and a moral framework that gives cohesion to society. That's what we call religion. In fact, religion comes from religare, which means to bind together, to bring society together. So, can you say that, for example, in the United States, where they have a huge plurality of Protestant churches, actually what really binds society together deep down is the idea that everything can be solved with freedom and democracy. You can judge it however you want, good, bad, or neutral, but I'd call that a very religious approach. Religious doesn't necessarily mean believing that something transcendental exists. But notice that, for example, you who have criticized Catholicism a lot, one of the central points of Catholicism in the last 3 or 4 years has been that you can be born in the wrong body, which means that you exist before being born into a body. That's the pre-existence of the soul. I mean, that's a religious category, you know? So I return to the idea that we've moved past religions and believe there are none left. I think that's something very typical of our time, but that doesn't make it true. Now, going back a bit to the time we were talking about, right? The 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, there's a very important point here, which is the Lutheran Schism, and then the whole Protestant Reformation and everything that will involve the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal, which is an important point. And it's about considering that since all men are children of God and there is no difference by race, in fact, the very term race and the way it has been used comes later, and especially from Protestant countries or countries with a strong Protestant influence. That never existed in the Catholic world. The idea was always integrating peoples. In fact, Rome, the Roman Empire, from which Catholicism draws directly from Greece and Rome, is precisely about the integration of peoples from completely different cultures. Of course, what did the Romans do there? There were many pagan religions and so on. Well, yes, but more or less they managed to get along. A shared pantheon across the Mediterranean, and they bring it all together in the cult of the emperor. That's why, based on my earlier definition, the common Mediterranean religion was the Roman emperor cult. Christians challenge this, so they are sent to the lions until the empire eventually converts. When the empire converts, there has already been that great, let's say, it's not homogenization. The word I'm looking for. It's like a cohesion of the whole society around a series of values that, with the arrival of Christianity, becomes even more consolidated. So what happens? Remember, we're in the Renaissance, and people and empires are reclaiming those ideas now. Intellectual elites are always discussing Greece and Rome. Those ideas are always present, right? So what happens when Cortés arrives in Mexico? Does he see himself as Alexander the Great? This isn't a joke. He actually starts imitating Alexander the Great, if you believe what Alexander did. Alexander the Great married his generals to the princesses of the lands he conquered with a Persian or Med princess or someone similar. That's what Cortés does. He marries his men to Totonac, Tlaxcalan, and Mexica princesses. Why? Because it's how to integrate.
He burned the ships like Alexander the Great.
Well, here we have to say that what he actually did was dismantle the ships. He didn't burn them.
He burned them, Alexander.
It's been somewhat romanticized.
It's been romanticized, but still, there's similarity.
Of course. So is that it? He marries his men to his princesses. He himself has this idea that what needs to be done is to replicate Spain. That is, he himself is the one who gives the name to what we now call Mexico. He gives it the name New Spain because he has the idea of replicating Spain there, of making a new Spain. Parenthesis. Many say Spain didn't exist then. So why did Cortés name it New Spain? Was he some kind of divine being, right? I see the future. So this is important too, right? So in a way, he considers himself the heir to a millennia-old Greco-Latin legacy on one hand, and a Catholic Christian one on the other. He needs to integrate the people. How do you do that? With two things. First, Roman law, and second, baptism, becoming part of the same religious community.
And what about Mestizaje?
Mestizaje is also essential. It existed before Cortés, and I'll explain why. Queen Isabella, the Catholics will already mentions Mestizaje. Isabella the Catholic already says Spaniards should marry indigenous women and indigenous men should marry Spanish women. Isabella the Catholic states that clearly. Also, she died well before the conquest of Mexico. Spain then had just a few settlements in the Antilles, meaning very little was there. But the idea that people had to mix already existed. Keep in mind also that Spain has previous experience, which is the Reconquista. In the Reconquista, there was an issue, and that is that in Al-Andalus, there was practically no mixing. Why? Because since there were two religions, Islam and Christianity, Christians didn't marry Muslims, and Muslims didn't marry Christians. There were cases, of course, but it was by no means common. What happens? Well, the criteria were never ethnic, racial, or biological. Those categories didn't matter there. Religion did. You marry within your religion. What happens? When they reach Mexico, that's what they do. They are baptized due to imposed religion. And there are many myths about this as well. Is it true? Is it true that it was imposed? Of course, religions are imposed. And us? It's just like we discussed earlier, right? The Roman Empire converts to Christianity because the emperor adopts and enforces it. And what happens is that later on, people imagine, when you say the word impose, they didn't shoot people to make them kiss crucifixes, despite appearances. That's the fallacy, right? What's going on? That evangelization first brings a bunch of friars who learn the languages of the indigenous people. And isn't there a massive destruction of temples? Initially, because they try, let's say, not to turn the local population against them. In fact, at first there's a moment. Bernal Díaz del Castillo recounts this about Cortés and his men. And when they start to arrive there and go deeper into the continent, they see all those kinds of rituals, cannibalism, human sacrifices, really nasty things, and so on. The truth is, they must have been pretty disturbing. They must have given off a bad vibe. Not much, huh? Not much. Of course, the first thing they say instinctively, also remember there were large bloodstained statues and idols. Instinctively you say, man, we have to wipe out this crap, right? That's it. That's what goes through your mind at first. Friar Bartolomé de Olmedo, a Mercedarian friar, is the one who stops them. So he's a religious man, right? The stereotype says the priest tries to force belief, but actually it's the opposite. And why is that?
Read?
Oh, of course, because he's the most well-read, and he's the one who knows perfectly well the experience that has taken place in Spain with Islam. He says that destroying their temples would turn the native population against us, right? Right, what, right? First, establish power here. Calm things down, pacify the area, and ensure the crown's authority reaches here. And once we have that, what we need to do is learn their languages, which can be done. In fact, you know very well that languages like Nahuatl, Quechua, Purépecha, and Aymara have written grammar before languages like German or English, which now seem far more important to us than Nahuatl. Today they are, but at that time they were not.
People show us Spain's literary significance, of course.
Of course, that's mainly done by friars. But why do they do it? Because you need to communicate with the natives, which is already a good reason. But also because you must ensure the natives understand this empire has foundations. What I was telling you, religion, anthropology, and morality, that you have to. To be part of this, you have to understand it, and it has to be explained to you, and that's how it's done. In fact, the consequence of that is that the indigenous people are excluded from the Inquisition tribunal. Earlier, we discussed the myth of the Spanish Inquisition, which always comes up. Indigenous people were intentionally excluded as it was seen as nonsense. How are you going to judge a guy who is a convert, who just converted? You can't judge him because obviously he's going to make mistakes.
Yeah, and talking about the Spanish Inquisition, it's one of the biggest black legends. What is the official record of deaths by the Inquisition over more than 2 centuries?
Well, I haven't studied this in depth, but it's true that they are
Hundreds of people.
who have a clear view of it. It's something like that. I think it's more about 3,000 people over 3 centuries across the entire Spanish Empire, which, considering that it's practically
half of the world.
Of course, it's among the largest empires in history. That's actually not many. 100 executions a year during a time when they were common is quite few. Remember, if we're discussing 3,000 people, imagine if it were double, 6,000, or even 10 times more, 30,000. Hey, how many people died in the Protestant Reformation? You know? How many people were persecuted by the Lutherans and the Calvinists in Northern Europe? How many people did the English and the Scottish Calvinists kill? Of course, let's see if we get into a numbers war. It's very hard to defend. The truth. I mean, that's how it seems to me.
The real Inquisition came from the Protestants, who completely rebelled against the Catholic Church. They unleashed a wave of blood across Europe, which isn't discussed today.
Of course, keep that in mind. Well, let's see. We're back to the same thing. I mean, we mentioned them before, right? Societies are built on anthropological and moral frameworks known as religion. So, if you propose an anthropological and moral alternative, you have the possibility of splitting society in 2 or 3, depending on how many alternatives you offer. What is happening today in our societies that are very unstructured? Why? Because sometimes it feels like
too many alternatives that
anyone, I mean you and I, we could start our own religion. This was once unthinkable and still is in many places today. Why? Because it's still not accepted. Because then you're breaking away from society and it's considered that there's a greater good, which is being part of a community. What happens? Well, of course, the Reformation completely breaks with this, and it breaks Europe. You could argue it had already broken earlier with the East-West Schism and the Orthodox, right? But still, notice that the Orthodox, even as schismatics,
they maintain ties with Rome.
Of course. That is, even though they do not recognize the Pope as the head of the church and have a church, let's say, that has gone in parallel. Despite that, the anthropological and moral framework is practically identical. If you visit a small village in Russia or Extremadura, yes, the temple's aesthetics are different, but the morals that the priest teaches on Sunday at Mass are more or less identical, right?
Yes, it's the Orthodox Church, the natural sibling of the Church of Rome.
Exactly. What's going on? If you go to the Protestant equivalent in the Bible Belt in the United States, you have a completely different framework, totally different.
Protestantism has evolved to some extreme points. Nowadays, anyone can, in the United States specifically, anyone can have a Protestant church that even defends, marriage and adoption between people of the same sex, when that's strictly forbidden in the Christian Bible. There are so many strange things, like trying to be a Christian, but at the same time completely ignoring everything Christ says, literally. Yes, of course.
Sure. Or that, let's see, that's it.
And we're not making a value judgment here. No. We're just saying it's very clear.
I'll provide a strictly rational and objective analysis.
Yes, it's not analytical.
Exactly, analytical. Look, like I was telling you, yes. You have the ability to create a new anthropological and moral framework to modify society for your political, economic, and financial interests. You're going to be interested. A lot. Control religion. That's why the great powers have always tried to control religious powers, okay? In fact, you could say wokeism has largely tried to impose a new one on us.
Religion? Absolutely.
I'd say that today, in 2025, knock on wood. It's declining now, but 2 years ago, we didn't think so. Maybe in another 2 years, we'll see where we are.
Totally, it's really on the decline, yeah, or...
I mean, this shows you how fast these things move, that we think they never will. Society changes its mind and evolves rapidly. When? Sometimes they keep the same ideas for 2,000 years, then change their minds in just 2 weeks. I mean, what I want to say is that societies, we think highly of ourselves. We hold ourselves in high regard, but then we're very easily manipulated, right? And for example, in the United States, something happens and it's like this. Many Protestant churches, especially small ones, are not non-profit organizations. They actually operate as LLCs, so they can be bought and sold. Many times, they are bought by people, let me put it delicately, by people who aren't even Christian. Yes!
Yes. Everything that happens there in the realm of religion is really scary.
So, well, excuse me, okay, for interrupting you. But you have to realize that many of those visions, which we could define as heretical, are actually far from what that religion truly says. There could be an ulterior motive behind it, which is to lead society or certain sectors of society into a corner because there is someone who benefits from it.